and welcome to Creative Connections. Today we're exploring the perfect yet short-lived connection between light, weather, trees and woodland that produces an amazing carpet of springtime flowers in our ancient woodlands. Every spring in the south of England, bluebells appear as if by magic. But they are not appearing on their own. They are part of a brief, seasonal relationship between the woodland floor, the trees above them, the returning sun, and the changing spring weather.
And that is what makes them such a good subject for creative connections. Because a bluebell wood is not just a pretty display, it is the visible result of a relationship between bulbs in the soil, trees overhead, light reaching the ground, and the short spring window in which everything happens.
Exactly. And one of the questions people often ask is this: if a wood is full of bluebells, does that mean it is ancient woodland? Take somewhere like Clapham Woods in West Sussex. You see those bluebells and instinctively think, this place must have been here for centuries. Is that a safe assumption to make?
It feels like it should be. The bluebells seem to belong to something old.
It is a fair instinct, but not quite a complete answer. Native bluebells are widely recognized as an indicator species of ancient woodland because they favor long-established and relatively undisturbed habitat, but they are not proof on their own. They can also grow in hedgerows and in some parts of Britain in open ground. So bluebells are a very good clue, but not a standalone verdict. With Clapham Woods specifically, it is already described as ancient semi-natural woodland.
So the bluebells are not the proof, but they are part of the evidence. They fit the story of an old wood rather than creating it.
Exactly. They belong to a larger pattern: the soil, the continuity of tree cover, the associated plants, the structure of the wood, and the historical record. Bluebells are one of the signatures old woodland often carries.
And what do we actually call one of these displays? Do you think most people would say a carpet of bluebells?
Yes, that is the phrase. A carpet of bluebells is the common expression. You also hear people saying drifts of bluebells, but carpet feels right because what strikes you is the way the flowers cover the woodland floor, as if someone had laid down a soft blue layer beneath the trees.
There is another bluebell question people often ask, especially when they see them in gardens as well as in woods. Are all bluebells the same?
No, and that matters more than many people realise. The bluebells most closely associated with old woods in England are the native bluebells. But many people plant Spanish bluebells in their gardens, and there are hybrids too. So when people think they are seeing bluebells, they may not always be looking at the true native woodland flower.
So how do you tell the difference? Because at first glance they can look very similar.
The easiest clue is the stem. A native bluebell has a graceful, arching stem, and the flowers tend to hang mostly on one side. That gives it that bowed, delicate woodland look. A Spanish bluebell is more upright, and its flowers are arranged all the way round the stem, rather than mainly on one side.
So the native bluebell droops, and the Spanish one stands more upright?
Yes, that is a good way of putting it. Native bluebells are usually a deeper violet blue, and they are scented. Spanish bluebells tend to be paler, broader, and much less fragrant, but the flower arrangement on the stem is probably the quickest and clearest thing to notice.
And I suppose that adds something important to the story, because when people picture a bluebell wood, what they are really picturing is not just any bluebell, but the native woodland bluebell in relationship with that old, shaded environment.
Exactly. The native bluebell belongs to that woodland rhythm we have been talking about. The bulbs in the soil, the spring light before the canopy closes, and the shelter and moisture of the wood. Spanish bluebells may be attractive garden plants, but the true bluebell wood has a different feel because the native plant is part of that long-established woodland system.
Which brings us to the more interesting question. Why do they appear there at all? What is the trigger? Is it the sun, the length of the day, the rise in daily temperature?
The simplest answer is spring warmth opens the window and woodland light defines it. Bluebells are underground as bulbs for most of the year. Then, as late winter turns into spring and the ground warms, they come up fast. But they are not just responding to warmth in isolation. They are exploiting a very specific woodland moment. There is enough warmth to grow and still enough light reaching the ground because the canopy has not fully closed yet.
So it is not just spring has arrived, it is spring has arrived but the trees have not yet shut the door.
That is exactly it. Bluebells are spring opportunists. They take advantage of deciduous woods before the trees are fully in leaf. The broad-leaved trees above them are still building their own canopy. For a brief period, the light reaches the woodland floor, and the bluebells use it to leaf, flower, and start replenishing the bulb for the following year.
So there really is a kind of race?
Yes, a race for light is a very good way to describe it. Not a race in the dramatic sense, but an ecological one. Bluebells have to get moving before the trees above them leaf out too heavily. Once the canopy thickens, the woodland floor becomes much darker. The bluebells can tolerate that later, but they need the earlier bright phase to do the important work.
And that helps explain why bluebell time can feel so fleeting. One week the wood is full of light and haze and blue, and a week or two later the green overhead takes over.
Yes, and the timing shifts with the weather. Bluebells in the south of England often flower earlier than farther north because it is a bit warmer. Seasonal monitoring shows that warmer spring temperatures tend to bring flowering forward. In other words, the bluebells are tuned quite closely to temperature, especially in late winter and early spring.
So the weather is setting the pace, and the trees are setting the deadline?
That is a very good way of putting it. The spring warmth gets the bluebells going, but the trees determine how long the light will last on the woodland floor. So what you see in a bluebell wood is really the result of those things working together: sun, temperature, trees, and timing.
Now let me ask this question because I've noticed this quite a lot. What happens if people walk over bluebells?
They can do serious damage. Bluebell leaves are soft and easily crushed. Those leaves are the plant's solar panels. If they are damaged, the plant cannot photosynthesize properly, which means less energy goes back into the bulb. Repeated trampling also compacts the soil and can damage the bulbs themselves. The sad thing is that the visible damage is quick, but the recovery is slow. Colonies can take years to recover.
So when people step in for the perfect photograph, they are not just flattening flowers for the day, they are reducing next year's display as well.
Yes, because they are interrupting the plant's ability to store energy and reproduce. And once one person makes a track through bluebells, others often follow the same line, turning a continuous carpet into broken patches.
I've witnessed this myself, trampled paths and patches through a lovely carpet of bluebells. And what about picking them?
Uprooting wild bluebells is unlawful, and trade in wild collected native bluebell bulbs and seeds is prohibited. Ecologically, picking flowers is also harmful because it removes part of the plant's reproductive effort, and in practice, flower picking often comes with trampling as well. Bluebells are one of those flowers best left entirely where they are.
Now the harder woodland management question. Suppose the trees around a bluebell colony are felled, not thinned a bit but removed so that the bluebells are left permanently exposed. What happens then?
The answer is, it depends on the degree and the aftermath, but permanent exposure is usually not the condition native bluebells are best adapted to. They like woodland conditions, humidity, continuity, and generally dappled shade rather than either dense darkness or full open sunshine. A heavily closed canopy can suppress woodland ground flora, so some opening can help, but sudden lasting exposure can dry the site, change the microclimate, and allow more aggressive plants to take over. That is when bluebells can begin to decline.
So the relationship with the trees is more subtle than more trees good, fewer trees bad?
Much more subtle. Bluebells need the trees, but not in every possible state. They benefit from a deciduous woodland structure that lets in spring light and then gives shelter, moisture, and continuity afterwards. Too dark is a problem. Too open can also be a problem. Their real preference is that shifting middle ground that woodland offers naturally.
Which makes bluebells feel less like isolated flowers and more like participants in a three-way relationship between the bulbs below, the trees above, and the weather moving through the whole system.
Yes, and that may be the deepest connection here. Bluebells are not just in the wood, they are part of the wood's spring timing. They respond to temperature, they use the sunlight, they depend on the delay before the canopy closes, and they rely on the woodland staying woodland. They are a seasonal expression of the relationship between light, leaf, and time.
And perhaps that's why a bluebell wood feels so moving. You are not just seeing flowers, you are seeing a narrow interval, a moment in the year when the trees have not yet fully claimed the sky, when the sun can still reach the ground, and when the whole wood briefly reveals the mechanism of spring.
Yes, and that is why the display feels both abundant and fragile. It is abundant because the conditions are right, fragile because the conditions are brief. Too much shade, too much disturbance, too much trampling, too much exposure afterwards, and the balance begins to go. That is also why bluebells are such a good emblem of old woods. They reward continuity.
One last thing, are there any other questions we ought to be asking about bluebells that people maybe do not think about?
I think so. One is how much Spanish bluebells and hybrids may be altering what people think of as a native bluebell wood. Another is how dependent bluebells are on the precise balance of light, shade, moisture, and woodland continuity. They can look abundant and robust, but in fact they are quite closely tied to a particular set of conditions.
So, in the end, the bluebells are not just a pretty display in the woods, they are the visible sign of a connection between the bulbs in the soil, the trees overhead, the sunlight reaching the woodland floor, and the spring warmth that sets the whole process in motion.
Yes, and perhaps that is why a bluebell wood feels so special. What you are seeing is not just flowers, but a short-lived balance between light, weather, trees, and woodland, a perfect spring connection. Thank you for listening to Creative Connections. If you enjoy our work, please click like and subscribe because it helps us keep the channel going and produce better content.